The post commander had just called the name when the door opened. He had called it the way post commanders call names at Veterans Day ceremonies, with the specific formal weight of a man who understands that the name is not just a name, that it is attached to a record and a service history, and a list of actions that produced the decorations being cited, and that calling it correctly is the least thing the occasion requires. He had said Colonel Alton Jerome Beaumont, United States Army, retired 30 years of service. Silver Star, Bronze Star with V device. 3 Army Commendation Medals, veteran of 3 combat deployments. Life member of VFW Post 4412, and the man whose name is the 3rd one on the left on the wall of honor behind me. The door had opened because the officer standing outside it had just removed the man whose name had been called. The hall went quiet. The post commander stood at the podium. He looked at the door. He looked at the officer. He said, "Where is he?" The officer said, "Sir, I asked the gentleman to wait outside. He did not have his membership documentation." The post commander said, "That gentleman is the reason 3 of those medals on that wall exist. Get him back in here." That was the moment that ended the incident and began the accounting of what the incident had been and what it had required of the man who had experienced it, and what the accounting produced in the months that followed. The man was Alton Jerome Beaumont. He was 71 years old. He had served in the United States Army for 30 years. He had been a member of VFW Post 4412 for 19 years. His photograph had been on the Wall of Honor for 11 years. He had forgotten his membership card at home for the first time in 15 years. And a security officer named Derek Howell, 26 years old, 11 months on the job working the Veterans Day event at the hall on an off-duty employment contract, had decided that a 71-year-old black man without a card was a man who did not belong inside. Howell had said at the door, "I need to see your membership documentation, sir." Alton had said, "I left my card at home. I have been a member here for 19 years. You can check the rolls." Howell had said, "I cannot let you in without documentation, sir." Alton had said, "I understand the policy. I am asking you to check the member rolls. My name is Alton Beaumont. I am on the Wall of Honor inside the front entrance. I am also on tonight's program as an honoree." Howell had said, "I cannot verify that, sir. I need you to step aside and wait until I can confirm." Alton had said, "I will wait." He had waited for 12 minutes. He had stood on the steps of the VFW Hall on a November evening in Vicksburg, with the specific patience of a man who has spent 30 years in situations that required him to wait while other people made decisions, and who has therefore developed a functional relationship with waiting that most people do not have. He had stood without visible agitation. He had not raised his voice. He had not reapproached the door after the first exchange. He had thought while he waited about the specific quality of the assessment that Howell had made. He had been through this kind of assessment before. Not exactly this, not a veteran's hall door, but the underlying structure was the same, a person in authority who has formed a conclusion before acquiring the information necessary to support it, and who has then failed to acquire the information because the conclusion was already made. He had been through this version of it as a young officer when people had assumed from what they saw that he was not the authority in the room, and had been corrected by the situation revealing itself. He had been through it in Bosnia and Iraq in contexts where the local population had formed assessments of American officers that the situation then revised. He had watched it happen in both directions. He knew how it worked. He also knew what the 12 minutes on the steps of the VFW hall were. They were not Howell forgetting to check the membership rolls. They were Howell having formed an assessment and not finding any urgency in the task of revising it. The membership rolls were inside. The contact number was in Howell's notebook. The program was in Howell's hand. None of these things had been consulted. He had stood on the steps and understood all of this and had waited. In those 12 minutes, Howell had not checked the member rolls. He had spoken to 2 other people who had arrived with documentation. He had let them in. He had not returned to Alton. He had not spoken to anyone inside the hall about the man waiting at the door. Alton had said, after 12 minutes, "I have been waiting." Howell had said, "I have not been able to confirm your status, sir." Alton had said you have not attempted to confirm my status. I asked you to check the member rolls. I asked you to look at tonight's program. You have done neither. Howell had said, Sir, if you cannot provide documentation, I am going to have to ask you to leave the premises. Alton had said, I'm going to walk inside and find the post commander. He knows who I am. Howell had put his hand on Alton's arm. Alton had stopped. He had looked at the hand. He had said, remove your hand. Howell had said, sir, you need to come with me. Alton had said, I am 71 years old. I am a retired colonel in the United States Army. I have been a member of this post for 19 years. Remove your hand. Howell had said, sir, I need you to step outside. Alton had gone outside. He had not gone because Howell had been right. He had gone because he was 71 years old, and he had spent 30 years in uniform learning exactly what a situation like this one required, and what it required was not a confrontation at a door. It required a conversation with someone who had the authority to resolve it, and that conversation was better had outside, where it could be conducted without becoming a scene. He had stood outside. Inside, the post commander had reached the fourth name on the citation list. He had called it. He had called the third name on the list. He had called Colonel Alton Jerome Beaumont. The door had opened. Alton Beaumont had grown up in Vicksburg, Mississippi, the second of 4 children of Jerome Beaumont Sr. and Luella May Beaumont, in a house on the south side of the city that his father had purchased in 1951 after returning from Korea with both his legs and a Bronze Star, and the specific, determined intention of a man who has seen what he has seen and who has decided that the next thing he is going to do is build something permanent. Jerome Beaumont Sr. had built something permanent. He had come home from Korea in December of 1951 on a troop transport that docked at a port in South Carolina, and had taken the bus to Mississippi and had arrived in Vicksburg on a Wednesday morning in the specific gray winter light of a Mississippi December, carrying a duffel bag and a Bronze Star, and the particular unspoken weight of a man who has been in a war and who is now required to return to a world that does not fully understand what he has been in. He had been in Korea for 14 months. He had been in places whose names he had not known before the Army had sent him there, and whose names he still said 40 years later, with the specific flat pronunciation of a man who learned them under conditions that were not pedagogical. He had been a private first class in the infantry. He had been in the Chosin Reservoir campaign of November and December of 1950, which was one of the specific engagements of the Korean War that people who were not in it did not fully understand, and people who were in it did not talk about very much because talking about it required describing things that the available language was not adequate to describe. He had talked about it once to Alton when Alton was 17 and had said he was thinking about the Army. He had said, I want you to know what it is. Not what you think it is, what it is. He had talked for 2 hours. When he was done, Alton had been quiet for a long time. Then he had said, and you are still glad you went. His father had said, I am glad I came back. I made my peace with the going. He had worked 31 years at the Vicksburg shipyard, which was what the men on the south side of the city who came home from wars and needed work did. The shipyard was on the river 3 miles from the south side house, and Jerome had ridden the bus to it for the first 7 years and driven his own car to it for the subsequent 24, and he had worked every shift he was assigned without complaint, and had taken pride in the work in the specific way of a man who understands that the thing he is making is going to be used by other people, and that making it correctly matters regardless of whether the people who use it know who made it. The shipyard made barges. Jerome had been a welder. He had learned welding in the Army, a secondary skill picked up during a posting before Korea in the specific way that the military trains people in skills they will need later, even if they do not know they will need them later. And he had brought the skill to the shipyard and had spent 31 years applying it with the same attention to detail that he had brought to the Army and that he had tried to build into his children. Alton had gone to the shipyard once when he was 12 on a Saturday when a supervisor had allowed family visits. He had stood at the edge of the floor and had watched his father work. He had seen for the first time what his father's hands looked like when they were doing the thing his father's hands were for. He had watched the precision of it, the angle of approach, the consistency of the bead, the way his father moved along the seam without hesitation, as though the seam were a path that had been there all along, and he was simply following it. He had gone home and had said to his mother, "Daddy is very good at that." Luella had said yes. He is very good at it. And he knows he is very good at it. That is why he does it the same way every time. Alton had said, "Does he like it?" She had said, "I think he likes doing the thing correctly. Whether he likes the thing itself is a different question." He had thought about that for a long time. He had thought about it many times in 30 years of command when he was watching soldiers do things well or badly, when the question of whether someone liked the work or simply liked doing the work correctly was a question with real implications for how you led them. His father had done it correctly for 31 years. He had used the wages from those 31 years to pay the mortgage on the house and put 4 children through school and maintain in the specific dignified way of a man who understands what dignity costs and what it is worth the household that Luella ran with the particular precise intelligence of a woman who knows exactly what she has and exactly how far it needs to stretch. Luella May Beaumont had grown up in Natchez, 60 miles south of Vicksburg, the daughter of a man who had driven mail routes for the post office for 28 years, and a woman who had taken in sewing and had, by the time Luella was 12, built the sewing work into a business that had 6 regular customers and a reputation on the south side of Natchez for doing the work correctly. Luella had watched her mother build that business from nothing, and had understood from watching that building something required the same skills regardless of the material you identified, what was needed. You assessed what you had. You worked the gap between them with precision and without complaint. She had applied this to the Beaumont household for 54 years. She had applied it to 4 children, 3 of whom had gone to college and 1 of whom had gone to Vietnam, and to a marriage that had survived 31 years of shift work at the shipyard and the specific economic pressures of a black family in Mississippi in the 1950s and 1960s and 1970s, which were the kinds of pressures that could not be fully described in the terms available to people who had not navigated them, and that produced in the people who had navigated them successfully the specific practiced resilience of someone who has learned that the way through is to identify the next thing that can be done and do it. She had always found the next thing that could be done. Jerome had worked the shipyard, and Luella had run the household, and the 4 children had grown up in the house on the south side that Jerome had purchased in 1951, and that had a back porch and a fig tree in the yard that he had planted in 1952, and that had been producing figs every August since. Alton had grown up climbing that tree. He had grown up understanding from watching his father that service was not a thing you did and then put behind you. It was a thing you were. Jerome Beaumont Sr. had been a veteran every day of his life after Korea, not in the sense of a man who performed it, but in the sense of a man who carried it in the way he held his body, and the way he made decisions, and the way he talked to his children about what the world was and what it required of the people who lived in it. He had told Alton when Alton was 14, "The Army will try to teach you things. Let it teach you the things it is good at teaching. But do not let it teach you what you are worth. That is not something an institution can tell you. That is something you have to know before you arrive." He had said this in the kitchen on a weeknight after dinner, with Luella doing the dishes and his younger brother already in bed and his older sister already gone to Jackson for college. He had said it in the specific direct way of a father who is deciding that this is the moment for the thing he needs to say. He had said, "I am not telling you not to go. I am telling you to go knowing what you are going in with. Because they are going to try to tell you in 100 different ways, most of them indirect, what you are worth. And the ways they will tell you will be wrong. And if you know your worth before they try to tell you it, you can hear them saying the wrong thing and not believe it." Alton had said, "How do you know your worth before you go?" His father had looked at him. He had said, "You are the son of a man who came home from Korea with both his legs and a Bronze Star, and bought a house on the south side, and planted a fig tree in the yard, and raised 4 children, and worked 31 years without missing a day. You are the son of a woman who ran that household with the precision of a general, and the patience of a person who understands that what is being built takes longer than what is visible. You know what you come from. You know what it cost. That is what you are worth. That is not something the Army can give you, and it is not something the Army can take away." Alton had said yes. His father had said good. "Now tell me when you are thinking about enlisting. I want to have that conversation before you sign anything." He had had that conversation 6 years later. It had been 2 hours. It had been in the same kitchen at the same table after dinner, with Luella still doing the dishes and the night sound of the South Side coming in through the screen door. Jerome had told him what Korea was. He had told it in a way he had not told it before, to anyone, not to Luella, not to his other children, not to the men at the VFW Post who also knew what Korea was, because they had been there. He had told it to Alton because Alton was about to go, and because what Alton was about to go into was not Korea, but was the same thing Korea was in the way that matters. It was a place where the decisions had real consequences, and where the consequences were not abstract. He had said, "I am not going to tell you the worst thing I saw. I am going to tell you the thing that is most useful to you. The most useful thing I can tell you is this: you are going to make decisions in conditions that do not permit certainty. The decision has to be made anyway. The way you make it in those conditions is you use everything you have, every piece of information, every piece of training, every piece of what your father and your mother put into you. You use all of it, and you make the call, and you go forward. And afterward you account for it honestly. You write the after action. You do not soften what happened. You put it in the record so that the next person has what they need." He had said, "That is the thing. The record is what you leave. Make sure it is honest." Alton had said yes. He had enlisted the following week. He had arrived knowing it. He had enlisted at 20 in 1974 at the recruiter's office on Washington Street in Vicksburg, with the specific, clear intention of a young man who has grown up watching his father carry a service history with integrity, and who has decided that the way to honor that history is to build his own. He had built his. He had gone to basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina in July of 1974, in the specific heat of a South Carolina summer that was different from the heat he knew from Mississippi. Drier, more direct, without the particular coastal weight of Mississippi August. And he had learned in those 8 weeks that his father had been right about what the Army could teach, and what it could not. It could teach you the specific skills it needed you to have. It could not teach you what you were worth. That knowledge had to be in place before you arrived, or the Army would replace it with its own version, which was not the same thing and was not worth having. He had arrived with his version intact. He had gone to Germany in 1975, assigned to an infantry division near Heidelberg, and had spent 3 years there in the specific routine way of a peacetime army posting training exercises, the particular institutional life of a soldier in a garrison that is not a deployment, but is also not home. He had been promoted twice in those 3 years. He had been identified as an officer candidate. He had gone to officer candidate school in 1978. He had graduated and been commissioned as a second lieutenant. He had gone back to Germany. He had led a platoon and then a company over the next decade in Germany, and in various posts in the continental United States, in the specific way of a career that is built by doing the work well enough that the next responsibility arrives as a consequence of the previous one. He had been promoted steadily. He had been sent to the Army Command and General Staff College in 1987, which was the education a career officer received when the institution had decided he was going to be given more responsibility and needed the intellectual framework to exercise it. He had built his. He had spent 30 years building it in Germany in the late 1970s and 1980s, in the Gulf in 1991, in Bosnia in 1995, and 1996 in Iraq in 2003 and 2004. He had led platoons and companies and battalions. He had made decisions in conditions that did not permit the luxury of uncertainty. He had carried the specific weight of command in the way that his father had described it to him when he was young. You are responsible for the people under your authority, not for their feelings, for their lives. Do not confuse those two things. He had not confused them. He had made decisions that cost things. He had made decisions that saved lives. The Silver Star, which was on the Wall of Honor at VFW Post 4412, framed beside his photograph, and his citation in the spot that was third from the left in the column of the Post's most decorated life members, had come from the second day of the ground campaign in Kuwait in February of 1991. He had been a captain. His company had been in the wrong position relative to the map coordinates they had been given, which was the kind of error that happens in the specific confusion of a ground campaign that has been moving faster than the planning assumed. 3 of his vehicles had been in the line of fire of a friendly unit that had not known they were there. He had made the decision, and he had made it in 4 seconds, and the decision had been to move the vehicles into exposed terrain in order to get them out of the line of fire before the friendly unit fired again. The decision had exposed him and 2 of his soldiers to direct fire from an Iraqi position that they had not known was there. He had made that calculation. He had known the position was possible. He had made the decision anyway because the alternative was 3 vehicles and 22 soldiers in the path of friendly fire. All 22 soldiers had survived. One of the 2 soldiers who had been exposed with Alton had been hit. He had been hit in the right leg. He had been evacuated. He had survived and had been medically discharged and had, according to the card he had sent Alton in 2007, been working as a mechanic in Georgia for the previous 12 years and had 3 children. The card had been in response to a letter Alton had sent to the last known address in his file, because Alton had made a practice in his later career of maintaining contact where he could with soldiers who had served under him in combat. Not all of them there were too many over 30 years for all of them to be possible, but the ones who had been in situations that he carried in the specific way of a commander who understands that the people in those situations are connected to him, not by friendship necessarily, but by the shared experience of a moment that is not shared with anyone else. The soldier's name was Marcus Webb. He had written back. He had said, "I think about Kuwait sometimes. I do not think about it the way I used to. What I think about now is that you made the call and we came out, and I have been here for the 12 years since. I am glad you made the call." Alton had said in his next letter, "I am glad you are there to write me the letter." Alton had received the wound that was in the citation, a shrapnel fragment to the left shoulder that had been removed at a field hospital and that had left a scar he still had. He could feel the scar if he pressed on it in a certain way. He did not press on it. It was there. It was a record of what the day had cost and of what the day had been worth. His father had said when he got home from Kuwait, "You made the right call." Alton had said, "I know. I went through it 1,000 times." His father had said if you had gone through it once and come out the same place, it would be luck. Going through it 1,000 times and coming out the same place, that is judgment. Jerome had asked separately about the wound. Alton had shown him the scar. Jerome had looked at it. He had said, "My father had one of these from the First War. Different location. He showed me once. He said that is the day that changed everything, and everything stayed the same." Alton had been quiet. Jerome had said, "I think I understand what he meant now." Alton had said, "What did he mean?" Jerome had said that the day could have gone the other way, and it went this way instead, and neither outcome would have been deserved, and neither would have been fair, and both would have been real. The everything that changed was whatever the other way would have been. The everything that stayed the same was you. Alton had not said anything. He had put the scar back under his shirt. He had said, "Yes, I think that is right." He had carried that. He had carried it through Bosnia in 1995 and 1996, where his battalion had been part of the NATO implementation force, and where the work had been the specific, difficult work of a military presence in a place that has recently experienced atrocities and that is trying to determine whether peace is possible. It was not combat in the sense of Kuwait, but it was not peacekeeping in the sense of a routine posting. It was the work of a commander who had to make constant decisions about the use of force and the maintenance of restraint and the specific line between those two things that could not be crossed without consequences that would outlast the mission. He had made those decisions. He had not always been certain. He had made them anyway because a commander who is not certain but who refuses to act is as dangerous as a commander who acts without sufficient information. The skill was in making the best available decision with the information available and then documenting it so that whoever came behind you could learn from it. He had carried that through the last years of his career through Iraq in 2003 and 2004, where he had been a colonel commanding a brigade and where the decisions had been larger and the stakes had been higher, and the specific weight of command had reached the level that his father had described from Korea. You are responsible for the people under your authority, not for their feelings, for their lives. He had been responsible for 900 people. He had brought as many of them home as the situation had permitted. He had not brought all of them home. He carried that too. The retirement ceremony had taken place at Fort Hood, Texas, where he had been assigned for his final posting. It was in the auditorium of the post's main conference building, with the specific formal choreography of a military retirement, the order of precedence, the color guard, the reading of the service record, the presentation of the retirement flag. Celestine had been there. Jerome II had come at 32 with his wife and with Trey, who had been 2 years old, and who had no memory of it but who had seen the photographs. Jerome Beaumont Sr. had not been able to come. He had been 83, and his health had not permitted the travel. Alton had called him from the hotel room the night before the ceremony. His father had said, "I want you to know that I have been tracking your career since the day you enlisted." Alton had said, "I know, Daddy." Jerome had said, "I want you to know that the night you made captain, I went out to the back porch and I sat for a long time." Alton had said, "What were you thinking?" His father had said, "I was thinking about Korea. I was thinking about the men who did not make it back. I was thinking about what I came home to build and what you built with it." He had said, "You are retiring as a colonel. I came home as a private first class with a Bronze Star. I want you to understand that I understand the distance between those two things and what it required of you." Alton had said, "It required what you gave me," his father had said, "and what was that?" Alton had said, "The house, the fig tree, the 2 hours you spent telling me what Korea was before I signed anything." Jerome had been quiet. He had said the 2 hours. Alton had said yes. Jerome had said, "I thought you would talk me out of enlisting." Alton had said the 2 hours were why I enlisted. "You told me what it cost. You told me it was worth it. I believed you, and I went and found out for myself that you were right." Jerome had been quiet for a long time. He had said, "I am proud of you, Alton." Alton had said, "I know, Daddy, I know." He had not brought all of them home. He carried that too. He had retired in 2004 at 61 with the specific, clear-eyed understanding of a man who has done what he set out to do and who knows exactly what it cost and who is ready to do the next thing. The next thing had been Vicksburg. He had come home. He had come home to Celestine, who had been his wife for 42 years, and whose 42 years of marriage to a career officer had produced a woman who was in the specific practical sense that 30 years of Army life creates more capable of building a household from scratch in an unfamiliar place than most people are capable of maintaining one in a familiar one. Celestine Beaumont, born Celestine. Marie Tatum had grown up in Jackson, Mississippi, the daughter of a teacher and a pharmacist, and had met Alton in 1979 at a social event at a church in Heidelberg, Germany, where her older sister was married to an Army officer and where Celestine was visiting for the summer, having just completed her first year of a teaching certificate program at Jackson State University. She had been 23. He had been 25, a first lieutenant with 18 months of Germany under his belt, and the specific alert quality of a young officer who is learning that the job is more complex and more interesting than he had understood it to be. She had said to her sister on the first evening, "Who is the lieutenant with the good posture?" Her sister had said, "That is Alton Beaumont. He is from Mississippi." Celestine had said, "Of course he is." They had been married within the year. She had completed her teaching degree at a university in Georgia, in the first of the 3 states where she would complete or extend educational coursework during the 30 years of moves that followed. She had taught school in Germany and in Georgia and in Virginia and in Kansas and in Colorado and in North Carolina and in 3 other postings of shorter duration. She had held a Mississippi teaching certificate which she had maintained through the correspondence coursework and periodic visits that the certificate required and had returned to it when they came home. She had been a good teacher in the specific way that comes from teaching in multiple systems, with multiple populations of children, and understanding from that experience that the skills children need are the same across systems, but the way of building them changes depending on who the children are and what they are carrying. She had taught 4th grade in Vicksburg for 11 years after coming home. She had retired 3 years before the Veterans Day ceremony. She had been sitting in the front row beside the empty seat when Kenneth Pritchard called Alton's name and the hall went quiet. She had been the one who had looked at the door. She had known when the door opened and Alton came in and sat down and did not speak for a long time exactly what had happened outside and what it had cost him and what he was going to do about it. She had known him for 45 years. She had sat beside him through more difficult things than a door. She had put her hand on his. She had not said anything. She had not needed to. He had said on the drive home he made a determination before he asked. She had said yes. He had said, and then he did not ask for 12 minutes. She had said, "I know." He had said, "I am going to write the account." She had said, "Good. Write it when you are ready." He had said, "I am ready." She had said, "Then write it tonight." He had written it that night. He had written 3 pages at the desk in the study, where his service records were filed in the cabinet, and his photograph from the Kuwait citation was on the wall, and the fig tree was visible from the window in the specific bare way it was visible in November, standing in the yard, the way it had stood since 1952. The next thing had been Vicksburg. Coming home to Vicksburg had taken longer than the drive from Texas. It had taken the specific adjustment that a person makes when they return after 30 years to a place they left as one version of themselves, and are now returning as a different version. And the place has also changed, and the 2 changed things have to find each other. The house on the south side was the same house. Jerome had kept it. Luella had kept it. The fig tree was in the yard. The back porch was still there. The neighborhood had changed around it. Some of the neighbors he had grown up with were gone dead or relocated, and the houses had different owners, and the people who lived there did not know Jerome and Luella had been there for 50 years. But the house was there. He had gone to the hardware store on the first Saturday back. He had bought paint for the back porch railing which needed it. He had painted the back porch railing. He had stood on the porch afterward with a glass of water and had looked at the fig tree and at the yard and at the neighborhood that was different from the neighborhood he had left, and that was also in the ways that mattered the same. He had called his father. Jerome had answered on the second ring and had said, "How is the house?" Alton had said the porch railing needed paint. Jerome had said, "I know, I kept meaning to do it." Alton had said, "I did it." Jerome had said, "Good." The fig tree. Alton had said, "It is there, still producing figs." Jerome had been quiet for a moment. He had said, "I planted that tree the year after I bought the house. I was not sure it was going to make it the first winter. Mississippi winters are not cold enough to kill a fig tree, but I did not know that then. I covered it with burlap bags the first winter." Alton had said, "And it made it." Jerome had said, "It made it, every winter since." Alton had said, "I know, Daddy." Jerome had said, "I know you know, I am telling you anyway." Celestine had come home to Vicksburg with the orientation of a woman who has lived in 8 states and who has developed from 8 states the specific practical skill of becoming a person in a new place, quickly finding the grocery store, finding the church, finding the people who are worth finding, identifying the things that require knowing and learning them. She had applied this skill to Vicksburg, which had the advantage of being a place she already had context for. She had joined the church on the north side that she had attended as a girl when visiting cousins. She had called the school district about positions. She had introduced herself to the 3 neighbors on either side of the house by the end of the first week. She had said when they came home to Vicksburg for good, I always knew we would end up here. This is where you are from. He had said, this is where we are from. She had said, yes, that is right. They had come home. He had joined VFW Post 4412 in his second year back. The post was on the south side of the city, 2 miles from the house he had grown up in a building that had been a hardware store, and then a dry cleaner, and then the Veterans Hall, which it had been since 1987. The building was brick single-story with a parking lot that had been repaved twice since 1987, and a sign that said VFW Post 4412, Vicksburg, Mississippi in block letters above the door, and an American flag that flew on a pole at the corner of the parking lot that had been there since the building became the Veterans Hall. The Post's membership was approximately 240, of which maybe 110 were active members who attended events or meetings. The rest were life members who paid their dues and came when they could and considered the Post part of their identity without considering it part of their regular schedule. The active membership was mostly older men, the Vietnam generation, which was the largest cohort, and the Korea generation, which was the oldest and the smallest, and which included men who had served in the specific conditions of Korea, and who were now in their 80s and 90s, and who attended when their health permitted. There was a smaller population of Gulf War veterans, and a handful of younger members from Iraq and Afghanistan. The Post had a specific community quality that Alton had recognized immediately. It was the place where men who had served came to be in the company of other men who had served, which was a specific form of company that could not be replicated in other contexts, because the shared reference points were not things you could explain to someone who did not have them, and did not need to be explained to someone who did. He had walked in on his first Thursday meeting in 2005, and had sat in a chair and had listened more than he had spoken, which was his practice when entering a new institutional context. Listen first, contribute when you have something specific to contribute, do not perform participation. He had listened. He had heard Raymond Ellis tell a story about something that had happened at the fairgrounds fundraiser that was genuinely funny. He had heard Gerald Washington discuss the Post's finances with the specific, slightly exasperated patience of a man who has been having the same conversation about the same budget line for 14 years. He had heard 2 members have a disagreement about the Korean War that was actually a conversation about something else, which was the kind of conversation that veterans have when they are talking around the things they are not ready to talk about directly. He had gone home and told Celestine this is a good post. She had said, how do you know after one meeting? He had said, because the people are doing what they are here to do. They are not performing it. They are just doing it. She had said that is how you can tell about most things. He had said, yes. That is what I learned from your Uncle Earl. She had looked at him. He said you can arrive at the right place without having been given the directions. I think this is the right place. She had said, then stay. He had stayed. 19 years. The Post had met every Thursday for 19 years with him in it. He had served on the executive committee for 14 of those years. He had helped build the wall. He had helped organize 4 Veterans Day ceremonies and had attended all 19. He had been to the funerals and the cookouts and the color guard practices and the 2 occasions when the building's roof had needed work and the Post had organized the labor itself, because the contractor quote was more than the Post's maintenance budget, and Alton had gotten up on the roof with 5 other members on a Saturday in September and done what needed doing. He had done the work of the post the way his father had done the work of the shipyard, because the thing he was making was going to be used by other people, and making it correctly mattered regardless of whether those people knew who had made it. The post had a specific community quality that he had been part of for 19 years. He had come in as a life member and had been asked in his 3rd year to serve on the post's executive committee. He had served. He had helped build the Wall of Honor, which had been his idea. A permanent display of the post's most decorated members, with their photographs, their citations, and the specific durable record of what they had done and where they had done it. He had argued for it at a post meeting in 2012 with the specific organized presentation of a man who has spent 30 years making cases for resources in institutional settings. He had said the stories need to be on the wall, not in a file. On the wall where anyone who walks in can see them. The members who come in 10 years from now, when many of us are gone, need to know what this post has done. The families who come to events need to know. The people who volunteer here need to know. A file cabinet tells you that the information exists. The wall tells you what the information is. He had said the wall does not require a budget that we do not have. It requires the members to provide their photographs and their citation language and their willingness to be seen. He had said, "I will be the first entry on the wall if the post does not have someone better to start with." Gerald Washington had said the post has someone better, and you are going to be the 3rd entry from the left. The post had voted for it. The wall had been built over the following year by a post member named Wallace Pruitt, who had been a carpenter before his Army service and who had returned to carpentry after, and who had built the frames and the mounting system and the display cases for the citation documents in the specific, careful way of a craftsman who understands that the thing he is making is going to outlast him and who is therefore not cutting any corners. The wall had gone up in 2013. It displayed, at the time of the Veterans Day incident, 8 members of the post. The 3 men to the left of Alton's photograph were all Korea veterans. The 3 to his right were Vietnam veterans, including Gerald Washington, who had died in 2019, and whose photograph Alton looked at every time he walked past it. The 2 at the far right were Gulf War veterans, one of whom had served in a unit adjacent to Alton's unit in the Kuwait campaign, and whose citation language referred to an engagement that Alton had been 3 kilometers from. The wall had photographs, citation language, service dates, and branch of service for each entry. It had 32 words on Alton's entry, not counting his name and service information that described what he had done on the 2nd day of the Kuwait ground campaign. His photograph had been placed on it in 2013. He had not put it there himself. The post commander at the time, a man named Gerald Washington, who had served 2 tours in Vietnam and who had run the post for 14 years, had said, "Beaumont, your photograph goes on the wall. Don't argue." He had not argued. He had attended the Veterans Day event every year since. The Veterans Day ceremony at VFW Post 441-2 had a specific shape that had been established under Gerald Washington, and that Kenneth Pritchard had maintained because it was the right shape, and changing it would have been change for its own sake, which was not a thing either man had any patience for. The ceremony began at 7 in the evening following a dinner that the Post's volunteer committee prepared, and that was specifically not a catered dinner because Gerald Washington had established early that the dinner was made by members and volunteers because the dinner was part of the event, and the event was about community, and a catered dinner was not community. The dinner was always the same barbecue, pork, and chicken from the pit that lived behind the building, and that 2 post members were responsible for on the morning of the event, plus the specific assortment of sides that the volunteer committee produced in a rotating schedule that everyone understood, and that had not substantially changed in 15 years. Following the dinner, which lasted approximately 90 minutes because it was a dinner at a veterans hall, and dinners at veterans halls are not rushed, the ceremony began. The ceremony had 4 parts. The first part was the Pledge of Allegiance and the national anthem led by the Post's color guard. which consisted of 4 members in their respective service uniforms and which had been organized by a Vietnam veteran named Tyrone Simmons, who had been running the color guard since 2008, and who ran it with the specific, precise attention to detail of a man who understands that the color guard is the visual statement of what the post is, and who is not going to let the visual statement be anything other than correct. The second part was the reading of the names of the post's members who had died in the previous year. This was done by Kenneth Pritchard standing at the podium reading each name once and the hall being quiet after each name for a full 3 seconds before the next one. There were 4 names in the year of the incident. The third part was the citation ceremony, which was the part that had reached the 3rd name on the list at the moment the hall went quiet. The citations were the annual recognition of post members whose service records warranted specific acknowledgement in that year's program. The program chose 2 to 4 members each year, based on a rotation that ensured every member of the Wall of Honor was cited in the ceremony at least once every 3 years. This was Alton's year. The fourth part was the open remarks in which any member could stand and speak for up to 2 minutes on any topic related to the post or to service generally. The ceremony had been underway for 31 minutes when the hall went quiet. He had attended it on the night Derek Howell was working the door. Howell was 26 years old. He had grown up in Warren County, adjacent to Vicksburg, in a town called Redwood, that had a feed store and a gas station and a volunteer fire department and the specific rural quality of a place that is close enough to a city to have access to its services, but far enough to have its own distinct character. He had done 2 years at Hines. Community college had taken the security licensing course that his cousin had told him was the fastest way to get a steady paycheck. That was not a warehouse job, and had been working off-duty employment contracts for the police department for 11 months. He had worked the convention center 3 times. He had worked the fairgrounds twice. He had worked a church fundraiser and a private party at a downtown restaurant, and the Veterans Hall on 2 previous occasions, neither of which had been the Veterans Day ceremony, and neither of which had required him to make a credential determination more complex than checking whether a person had a ticket. The Veterans Day ceremony was his 3rd time at the hall. The instructions for the event had said VFW members only membership card required for entry. He had received those instructions at the briefing from the off-duty employment coordinator along with a contact number for the post's event coordinator, which he had written in his notebook and had not used during the 12 minutes he left Alton Beaumont waiting outside. He had looked at the contact number. He had not called it. He had looked at the program that the event coordinator had given him at the start of the shift, which listed the evening's honorees. He had read the first 2 names. He had not read the 3rd. He was not a bad person. He was a person who had looked at a 71-year-old black man without a card and had formed an assessment that the situation did not support, and who had then failed to do the 2 things that would have resolved the situation in 30 seconds, check the member rolls or speak to someone inside the hall. He had done neither. He had waited at the door while Alton waited outside, and the post commander had called the 3rd name on the citation list, and the hall had gone quiet and the door had opened. The post commander's name was Kenneth Pritchard. He was 67 years old. He had grown up in Vicksburg in a neighborhood 3 blocks from the house where Jerome Beaumont Sr. had planted the fig tree, and had enlisted in the Marines at 18 in 1975, which was late enough to miss Vietnam, but early enough to enter the post-Vietnam military, which had the specific complex character of an institution that has just been through a defining experience and is trying to determine what it is now that the experience is over. He had served 2 tours in later deployments, neither of which had been Vietnam, but both of which had been the kind of service that produces the knowledge of what service costs. He had come back to Vicksburg in 1985 and had worked for the city's Parks Department for 20 years and had joined VFW Post 4412 in 1987, the year the post moved into the building on the south side. He had known Alton Beaumont for 18 years. He had served on the executive committee with him for 14 of those years, and had been in those 14 years the specific kind of institutional colleague that every organization needs, and that not every organization has a person who shows up, does the work, and does not require the work to be about him. He had run the Post for 4 years following Gerald Washington's retirement with the same orientation the Post was for the members. The work was for the members, and his role was to make sure the work got done. He had known when the hall went quiet at the calling of the third name before he turned and looked at the door what had happened. He had known the way you know things in a room full of people when the room's attention has just been directed toward a specific absence. He had walked to the door. He had looked at Howell. He had looked at Alton. He had made the assessment that the situation required in about 2 seconds, which was an assessment of 2 things, what had happened and what was needed. What had happened was clear. What was needed was equally clear. He had walked to the door. He had looked at Howell. He had looked at Alton standing outside on the steps of the VFW hall on a November evening. He had said, "Alton, come in." Alton had said, "I was asked to wait outside." Kenneth had said, "I know. Come in." He had looked at Howell. He had said, "The man you just removed from this building is Colonel Alton Beaumont. His photograph is on the wall behind me. His name is on the program in your hand. He has been a member of this post for 19 years. Do you understand what I am telling you?" Howell had said, "Sir, he did not have documentation." Kenneth had said, "The documentation is on the wall. It has been on the wall for 11 years. Come inside, Alton." Alton had come inside. The hall had been quiet. The 47 people in the hall had watched him walk to his seat in the front row, which had been reserved for him, which had his name on a card, which Howell had seen and not connected to the man standing at the door without his card. It was approximately 15 steps from the door to the front row. He had walked them the way he had walked through rooms his entire adult life, with the specific unhurried bearing of a man who has been told through 30 years of institutional life and through 2 hours at a kitchen table in 1974 that how you hold yourself is part of what the record says about you. He had not rushed. He had not looked at anyone in particular. He had not avoided looking at anyone in particular. He had walked the 15 steps. He had turned and found his seat. He had sat down. The hall had been quiet in a way that was different from the quiet during the reading of the names. The quiet during the names was the quiet of tribute. The quiet now was the quiet of 47 people who have just understood something and who are processing it without speaking. Tyrone Simmons, who ran the color guard, was seated in the second row. He had served 2 tours in Vietnam. He was 69 years old. He had seen things that had required him to develop a specific clear-eyed relationship with what human beings were capable of. He had looked at Alton walking those 15 steps and had thought, "I know what just happened outside that door, and I know what it cost him to walk these 15 steps without looking like it cost him anything." Morris, seated to Alton's left, the one who had said at the Thursday meeting, "Next time, bring your card," had said nothing when Alton sat down. He had handed him the program, which was folded open to the citation section. He had said page 3. Alton had said, "Thank you." Morris had said, "You're on page 3. It was the right thing to say. He had sat down. He had been introduced. He had been introduced. He had stood up. He had received for the second time in his life, the first time having been in a field in Kuwait in February of 1991, from a general who had driven to the field hospital specifically for the purpose, the specific acknowledgement that a community gives to a man who has done what he has done, and who has come home, and who is still here. Kenneth had read his citation. He had read the 32 words, plus the service dates and the branch designation, and he had read them in the specific, unhurried way of a man who has been in the military himself and who understands that the words are not decorative. Each word in a military citation is there because it survived the specific review process that military citations go through, which is a process designed to produce precision. Every word that is there was defended. Every word that was removed because it did not survive the review. The 32 words said, for gallantry in action on the 25th of February, 1991, during Operation Desert Storm in the Republic of Kuwait. Displaying extraordinary valor in the face of hostile fire, Captain Beaumont exposed himself and 2 subordinates to enemy fire to prevent 22 soldiers from taking fire from a friendly unit. His actions directly saved those 22 lives. There were 47 people in the hall. They had heard those 32 words after watching their post commander walk to the door and retrieve the man who should have been sitting in the front row. They had known what that meant. There had not been applause in the conventional sense. There had been a sound that was different from applause, a sound that a room full of veterans makes when something has been said that lands correctly, which is a sound that is partly applause and partly something else, the release of a recognition that has been held in suspension since the moment the hall went quiet when the post commander called the 3rd name. He had sat down again. He had been quiet for a long time. He had thought about the 12 minutes on the steps. He had thought about the specific quality of those 12 minutes. The waiting. The awareness of what the waiting was and what was producing it. The decision to remain patient and not escalate the decision that had been based not on deference, but on judgment. The specific judgment of a man who has spent 30 years making assessments of what a situation requires and who has assessed that this situation required him to wait. He had waited. The situation had resolved the way he had calculated it would resolve, which was through the process, when the process was reached, producing the correct outcome. The process had worked. The damage was in the 12 minutes. Celestine, who was seated to his right, had put her hand on his. She had not said anything. She had not needed to. They had driven home from the Veterans Day ceremony in a car that was quiet in the specific way that a car is quiet when 2 people who have been married for 42 years are in it and one of them has just been through something and the other one is giving him the space to be in it. He had driven. He always drove. He had driven the route from the VFW hall on the south side to the house on the south side, which was a route of 4 minutes and 7 turns, that he had driven so many times that the driving required no conscious attention, which left the conscious attention free for the other things. He had thought about the 12 minutes. He had thought about the specific quality of standing on the steps of the VFW hall in November, with 30 years of service behind him and a photograph on the wall inside, and a membership of 19 years. And an event program with his name on it, and waiting for a man of 26 who had had the contact number in his notebook and had not used it. He had thought this is not a new thing. He had thought this is a very old thing. The version of it that is happening in 2024 is different from the version that happened to my father in 1951, but the structure is the same. The structure is a person in authority has formed an assessment, and the assessment is about what you look like, and what you look like has produced a conclusion, and the conclusion precedes any information, and the information therefore cannot revise the conclusion. My father navigated this every day for 50 years. I have navigated it differently in different contexts with different leverage, and tonight I navigated it on the steps of a building where my photograph has been hanging for 11 years. He had thought the photograph being there is what resolved it. Not my patience, not the 12 minutes. The photograph being there and the post commander calling my name. He had thought the photograph is there because I argued for the wall. The wall is there because the post voted for it. The post voted for it because the members understood that the stories needed to be visible. He had thought put the stories on the wall, not in a file. That is what I said. I said it because I knew this was coming, not this specific version of it, but the version of this that is always coming for men who look like me in rooms that were not always built with us in mind. The wall is there for that moment. That is what the wall is for. He had parked in the driveway. He had gone inside. He had sat in the study for a long time before he wrote the account. She had not needed to. The complaint was filed by VFW Post, 4412 on the following Monday through the Post's legal advisor, a woman named Patricia Okafor, who had been handling the Post's documentation for 7 years and who had in those 7 years drafted one previous complaint to a law enforcement agency about a different incident at a different event that had been resolved in a way that had taught her exactly what a complaint needed to contain and exactly what it needed to avoid. What it needed to contain specific facts in chronological order, with the names and roles of all parties, the timeline verified against whatever contemporaneous records existed, and the specific identification of what the applicable policy required and how the actual conduct had diverged from the requirement. What it needed to avoid editorializing emotional language claims that could not be substantiated, and any characterization of intent that was not directly supported by the documented facts. She had called Kenneth Pritchard on Saturday morning and had asked him to send her everything he had, the program listing Alton as a honoree, the Wall of Honor entry with its photograph and citations, the member rolls showing Alton's 19-year membership, and the name of the off-duty employment coordinator who had briefed Howell before the event. Kenneth had sent all of it by Saturday afternoon. She had the protocol for off-duty employment by Sunday morning obtained from the department's public-facing documents, which specified that officers working private event security contracts were required to contact the event's on-site representative when a credential dispute arose that could not be resolved at the door. She had built the complaint from those materials. The complaint was addressed to the police department's off-duty employment office, which managed the officer contracts for private events. It was 6 pages. It named the incident, the timeline, the specific failures, and the 11-year record of the man who had been made to stand outside the building whose wall his photograph had been on since 2013. The investigation took 2 weeks. The investigating officer was a sergeant from the Off-Duty Employment Division named Lucinda Marsh, who had been with the department for 16 years and who had handled off-duty employment complaints for 4 of them. She interviewed Howell Kenneth Pritchard and 2 post members who had arrived during the 12 minutes Alton was waiting and who had observed portions of the exchange. She reviewed the off-duty employment briefing documentation, which showed that Howell had been provided with the event contact number and had acknowledged receipt. She reviewed the event program, which showed Alton's name as the 3rd honoree. She reviewed the department's off-duty employment protocol, which showed the specific requirement to contact the event's on-site representative when a credential dispute could not be resolved at the door. She wrote a finding of 10 paragraphs. The finding said, Officer Howell failed to follow the department's off-duty employment protocol for credential disputes. He was provided with a contact number for the event coordinator at the start of his shift. He did not use it. He was provided with an event program that listed the complaining party as an honoree. He did not read it. The complaining party identified himself clearly, offered specific identifying information, including his Wall of Honor entry, and waited patiently for 12 minutes. Officer Howell did not take any of the available steps to verify the complaining party's status during those 12 minutes. The finding did not address what had produced Howell's failure to take those steps. The finding also said the complaining party's photograph and citation have been displayed in the hall's entry for 11 years. The complaining party is the 3rd entry from the left on the post's Wall of Honor. The failure to verify produced a situation in which a decorated veteran was excluded from a ceremony held in his honor. It found Howell had not followed the off-duty employment protocol for credential disputes at membership organizations, which required the officer to contact the organization's on-site representative when a dispute arose that could not be resolved at the door. Howell had not contacted Kenneth Pritchard or any other representative of the post during the 12 minutes Alton was waiting outside. Howell received a formal reprimand and was removed from the approved contractor list for VFW events. Jerome Beaumont, Sr. had died in October of 2009 at 88 years old in the house on the South Side that he had purchased in 1951 and that he had not left except for the regular intervals that his life had required. Work Church, the VFW Post, where he had been a member since his first year back from Korea, and the hospital in his last 2 years, when the congestive heart failure had required the visits that congestive heart failure requires. He had been in his own bed when he died. Luella had been in the kitchen. She had not known until she had gone to call him for dinner. Alton had flown in from Texas, where he had been on a consulting contract for 6 months following his retirement from the Army, and had arrived at the house in Vicksburg 12 hours after the call. He had sat in the kitchen with his mother for a long time. He had looked at the fig tree through the window. He had said at some point in the evening he made it to 88 in the house he built. Luella had said he did. Alton had said that is what he set out to do. She had said yes, he knew exactly what he was doing. Luella had lived in the house for 3 more years until a fall in the kitchen in 2012 had made it clear that the house required more than she could safely manage alone, and she had moved to a room in the assisted care facility on the north side of Vicksburg, where 3 other women from her church also lived, which had made the transition easier than it would otherwise have been. She had died in 2019 at 91 in the facility with Alton and Celestine present. The house had passed to Alton when Jerome died, which was what Jerome had intended, that the house stay in the family in Vicksburg, on the south side, with the fig tree in the yard. It was still there. It was still in the family. It was still on the south side. He had walked through the house on the morning after the Veterans Day ceremony, a Saturday morning, November, the light, the specific gray of a Vicksburg November, and had gone to each of the rooms in the order he had always gone through them as a child. His parents' room first, because that was where the authority was. Then the room he had shared with his brother until his brother went to Vietnam in 1967, and came home in 1969 and moved to Jackson. Then the small room at the back that had been his when he got his own room at 15. The house was different now. The furniture was different. The photographs on the walls were different. But the rooms were the same rooms, and the floors were the same floors, the same specific creak in the 3rd floorboard of the hallway, which he had memorized as a teenager coming in late, and which had not changed in 55 years. He had stood in the kitchen and looked at the fig tree. It was bare in the November light. It had been bare in November for all of the Novembers he had seen it, which were all of the Novembers of his life, from the one when he was an infant, and had not yet developed the visual processing to see it as a distinct thing to the one he was standing in now at 71, with 30 years of service behind him and a photograph on a wall 2 miles away. He had made coffee. He had sat at the kitchen table. He had thought about what his father had built and what he had built with it, and what his son was building and what his grandchildren would build, and whether the building was ever finished, or whether the question was simply whether the building continued. He had decided the building continues. The question is whether each generation builds on what was left or clears the ground and starts over. His father had left him the house and the fig tree, and 2 hours of telling him what Korea was. He had taken those things and built 30 years of service and a wall with photographs and a 3-page account to an oversight board that asked a question the procedure finding could not answer. His son was building something. His grandchildren would build something. The fig tree would be there. The wall would be there. The record would be there. He had drunk his coffee. He had gone outside. He had stood under the fig tree in the November light. He had put his hand on the bark of the trunk, which was the same bark it had always been, the slightly rough, slightly warm texture of a tree that has been in the same soil for 71 years and that knows exactly where it is. He had said quietly to the tree, or to Jerome Beaumont Sr., or to no one in particular, "You built the right thing." He had stood there for a moment longer. He had thought about the root system that Joy had correctly identified as the part underground that makes the visible part stay. He had thought about what the root system for the photograph on the wall was, what was underground invisible that made the photograph stay. It was a man who spent 2 hours telling his son what Korea was before the son signed anything. It was a woman who wrote into the record of the household every day for 54 years the specific evidence that things could be built and sustained. It was a veteran who came home from Korea with both his legs and a Bronze Star, and decided that the next thing he was going to do was build something permanent, and then spent 31 years making the wages to build it. It was 30 years of service, and the after-action reports, and the decisions made in 4 seconds in Kuwait, and the specific practice discipline of a man who knows what he is worth before he arrives anywhere. All of that was underground. The photograph was what was visible. He had gone back inside. Alton had read the investigation's findings at his kitchen table in the house on the south side of Vicksburg that his father had purchased in 1951, and that had passed to Alton on Jerome Beaumont Sr.'s death in 2009 at the age of 88, still in the same house, still with the fig tree in the yard which produced figs every August. He had said to Celestine it found what it found. She had said yes. He had said it did not find why he left me outside for 12 minutes without attempting to verify. She had said no, it did not find that. He had said I know why. He looked at me and decided before he asked. The 12 minutes were not about verification. If they had been about verification, he would have gone inside in the first 60 seconds. She had said yes, I know. He had said I am going to write it. She had said good, write it. He had written a 3-page account to the department's Community Oversight Board. He had written it that night in the study at the desk, where he had written 30 years of Army reports in the same precise, direct language, and he had written it in the same mode, not as a complaint in the emotional sense, but as a document in the functional sense, a record of what had happened that said what it said, and that could not be revised by anyone who had not been there. The account had 4 parts. The first part established who he was, his name, his age, his service record, his membership status at the post, and his role in the Veterans Day ceremony. He had included the specific language from the Wall of Honor citation, because the citation language was a matter of documented record, and because including it was not self-aggrandizement, it was evidence. The second part was a chronological account of the incident from his arrival at the hall through the 12 minutes on the steps through Kenneth Pritchard calling his name through his return to the hall. He had written it with timestamps where he had them, and with approximations where he did not, noting clearly which was which. The third part identified the specific failures, the failure to consult the member rolls when the membership dispute arose, the failure to use the contact number provided in the pre-event briefing, the failure to read the event program, which listed his name, and the failure to call the post commander despite 12 minutes of available time. The fourth part was the one he had thought about for an hour before writing. He had written, I want to be direct about what I believe produced these failures. They were not failures of memory or confusion about the procedure. The procedure is simple. When you cannot resolve a membership dispute at the door, you contact the event representative. Officer Howell had the contact number. He had 12 minutes. He did not make the call. I am asking the Oversight Board to consider why the call was not made. I will not speculate about the officer's intentions. I will note that the information available to him, my name, my self-identification as a post member and an honoree, my willingness to wait was not sufficient to produce the call. I am asking the board to consider what was sufficient instead, and whether the same sufficiency would have applied if the person at the door had looked different. He had written, that is the question the procedure finding does not answer. I am asking the board to put the question in the record. He had submitted it. The Oversight Board had acknowledged receipt within 3 business days. The acknowledgement was a standard form letter that said the board had received his submission, that it would be reviewed at the next regular board meeting, and that he would receive a follow-up communication. He had received the follow-up communication 6 weeks later. It was 4 paragraphs. The first paragraph summarized his account. The second paragraph noted the investigation's findings and the disciplinary action taken. The third paragraph said the board had reviewed the account and had noted the concern it raised about the assessment that had preceded the procedure failure. The fourth paragraph said the board had forwarded his account to the department's training division for consideration in the annual review of the off-duty employment training curriculum. He had read it twice. He had said to Celestine they are considering it for the training curriculum. She had said, what does that mean? He had said it means the account is in the training materials review. Whether it produces a change in the materials depends on whether the people reviewing the materials understand what the account is saying. But the account is in the review. She had said, "Is that enough?" He had said, "No. It is what is available. The available thing is not always enough. But you use the available thing because that is what you have, and because the available thing done correctly accumulates." She had said, "You believe that?" He had said, "I have to. I spent 30 years writing after-action reports. I wrote them knowing that most of them would be filed and read once and put in a drawer. But some of them were read by the next unit. Some of them changed how the next unit prepared. I wrote them all the same way." She had said, "Yes, I know you did." He had submitted it. The oversight board had acknowledged receipt. He had not expected a substantive response. He had not needed one. The document was in the record. He had attended the following Thursday's Post meeting, as he always did. He had driven to the hall on the south side and had parked in the parking lot and had walked to the door past the flagpole and past the sign that said VFW Post 4412 Vicksburg, Mississippi in block letters and had gone inside. He had walked past his photograph on the way in. He had not looked at it. He had sat in his usual seat, third from the left in the first row. The 12 or so members who attended the regular Thursday meeting were already there in the specific relaxed configuration of men who have been meeting in the same room for long enough that the seating arrangement has become a fact rather than a choice. 2 of the members had said when he sat down, "Alton, good to see you." He had said, "Good to see you." One of them, a Vietnam veteran named Morris, who had been a member for 30 years and who had a specific dry humor that came from 30 years of keeping a dry humor in the company of other veterans, had said, "I heard you had some trouble at the door." Alton had said, "I had some trouble at the door." Morris had said, "Next time bring your card." Alton had said, "I have been a member for 19 years without bringing my card once." Morris had said, "That's because you didn't need it until now." Kenneth had opened the meeting. He had said before the agenda that the Post had filed its complaint and that the finding was what it was, and that the Post was satisfied the record was complete. He had said, "If any member has questions about the complaint or the finding, I am happy to discuss it after the meeting." I want to say for the record that what happened at the Veterans Day ceremony was not the standard the Post holds for how its members are treated, and that the Post takes seriously its responsibility to make the hall a place its members can enter without that kind of experience. He had been quiet for a moment. He had said, and I want to say that Alton handled it with the same dignity he has handled everything else in the 19 years I have known him, and that the Post is proud to have him on the wall and proud to have him at this table. There had been a general sound of assent from the room. Alton had said, "Yes, the record is complete." Kenneth had said, "The wall is still there." Alton had said, "Yes." Kenneth had said, "Your photograph is still on it." Alton had said, "I know." Kenneth had said, "It will be there after we are both gone." Alton had looked at the wall. The wall had 8 photographs. He had looked at each of them in turn. The 3 to the left of his photograph were Korea veterans. The leftmost was a man named Raymond Ellis, who had been in the Post for 37 years before his death in 2018, and who had served in the same campaign in which Jerome Beaumont Sr. had served, though in a different unit and in a different sector. Alton had not known Raymond Ellis in Korea. He had known him for 16 years at the Post, where Raymond had been the kind of member who showed up for every event and who brought a bottle of something to every event, and who had a story for every situation that managed to be both instructive and funny without trying to be either. Raymond had been dead for 6 years. His photograph was on the wall. The second photograph from the left was a man named Earl Tatum, who had been Celestine's uncle by marriage and who had died in 1979 before the Post had the wall, and whose photograph had been placed there in 2013 from a family photograph that Celestine had provided. Earl Tatum had served in Korea and had come home and had worked as a post carrier for 32 years and had never spoken about Korea to his family. With one exception, he had told Celestine when she was 12 that the thing he had learned in Korea that he had not expected to learn was that you could be in a situation that seemed impossible and discover that you were capable of more than you had known. He had told her this in the specific, quiet way of a person who has decided that one piece of the thing is worth passing on, even if the rest of it stays private. Celestine had told Alton. Alton had included it in the citation text for Earl Tatum's Wall of Honor entry. He had said, "Yes, that is the purpose of the wall. That is why I argued for it." He had walked past the wall on his way out of the Thursday meeting. He had not hurried. He had walked at the pace of a man who is reading a wall and who understands that the wall is worth reading slowly. He had stopped at Gerald Washington's photograph, second from the right Vietnam veteran, 2 tours post-commander for 14 years, dead in 2019, and had stood with it for a moment. Gerald had been the one who had said, "Beaumont, your photograph goes on the wall." Don't argue. Alton had not argued. The wall was the result. He had said silently to Gerald's photograph, "Thank you for not letting me argue." He had looked at the photograph for a long moment. It was a good photograph. It had been taken at a ceremony in 1997 when Gerald had been 61 years old and had already been running the post for 8 years, and had the specific, settled quality of a man who is where he is supposed to be and knows it. He was looking at something off camera, not at the photographer, with the specific alert attention of a man who has heard something that interests him and is considering his response. That was Gerald Washington. That was why the photograph was right. He had gone home. His 3 grandchildren. Alton the third, who was 12, and Marcus, who was 9, and Joy, who was 7, came to the house on the Saturday following the Veterans Day ceremony. This was a regular occurrence, Saturdays at the house on the south side, where Celestine made lunch, and Jerome's fig tree was still in the yard, and the photographs were on the walls of the rooms and the documents were in the files in the cabinet in the study. The 3 grandchildren were the children of Alton's son, a man named Jerome Beaumont II, who had been named after his grandfather, and who lived with his family in a house on the east side of Vicksburg, 12 minutes from the house on the south side. Jerome II was 43 years old. He worked for the city's engineering department and had, in Alton's assessment, inherited his great-grandfather's orientation toward building things that lasted. He brought the children to the South Side house on most Saturdays and stayed for lunch and left in the early afternoon, and the children stayed until dinner because Celestine made dinner, and the children had inherited Celestine's opinion that Celestine's cooking was worth staying for. Marcus was 9 and had the specific energetic quality of a 9-year-old who is interested in everything and has not yet learned to filter the interest. He had asked Alton at the previous Saturday's visit why there was a photograph of Jerome Beaumont Sr. in the hallway next to the photograph of Alton in his uniform. He had asked because the 2 photographs were different. One was a portrait and one was official, and he had wanted to understand the difference. Alton had explained the difference. Marcus had said, "So the official one means you did something." Alton had said, "The official one means the Army documented what I did." Marcus had said, "And the portrait one just means Grandpa Jerome existed." Alton had said yes, though existing for 88 years in the way he existed is not a small thing. Marcus had thought about that. He had said, "I want an official photograph." Alton had said, "What did you want to do to get one?" Marcus had said, "I don't know yet. Something that someone will document." Alton had said, "Good. Figure out the thing first. The documentation will follow." Joy was 7, and had the specific, calm, observational quality of a child who does not feel the need to demonstrate that she is paying attention, which in her case was a misleading quality, because she was paying more attention than most adults, and simply chose not to announce it. She sat at the kitchen table during conversations that appeared to be between other people and absorbed the conversations completely. She had asked at a Saturday 3 weeks before the Veterans Day incident why the fig tree had no leaves. Celestine had said, "It is November, baby. The tree is resting." Joy had said, "It doesn't look like it's resting. It looks like it's waiting." Celestine had looked at her. She had said yes. "I think that is also right." Joy had said, "What is it waiting for?" Celestine had said August. Joy had said, "That's a long time to wait." Celestine had said, "The fig tree has been waiting since 1952. It knows how." Joy had looked at this tree for a long moment. She had said, "I want to be like that." Celestine had said, "Like what?" She had said, "Like something that knows how to wait because it has been waiting for a long time and it knows August will come." Alton the third, who went by Trey, which was what his father called him, and what had therefore become what everyone called him, had asked at the kitchen table Grandpa what happened at the Veterans Day thing. His mother had started to say something. Alton had put his hand up. He had said to Trey, a security officer at the door did not know who I was and did not want to let me in. Trey had said, "Because you forgot your card." Alton had said, "Because I forgot my card and because he looked at me and decided something before he checked." Trey had said, "What did he decide?" Alton had said, "He decided I was not who I said I was." Trey had been quiet. He had said, "How did you know what to do?" Alton had said, "I waited. I stayed calm. I let the situation resolve itself through the correct process." Trey had said, "But what if it had not resolved itself?" Alton had said, "Then I would have taken the next step. But you always start with the process that is available." Trey had said, "Were you angry?" Alton had looked at his grandson. Trey was 12 years old. He was in the 7th grade at a middle school on the north side of Vicksburg, where he played basketball and was in the band and had the specific alert quality of a 12-year-old who pays more attention to adult conversations than adults generally assume he does. He had his great-grandfather's forehead, which Celestine had noticed when Trey was an infant, and had said, "He has Jerome's forehead." Alton had looked and had not said anything because he was not sure that noting the inheritance of a forehead was a thing a man said out loud, but he had seen it and had been seeing it ever since. He had looked at his grandson. He had said yes. He had said, "I have been angry about this kind of thing since I was your age. The anger is not the problem. What you do with the anger is the question." He had said, "My father was angry about it." Your great-grandfather. He had been through things that gave him the right to a great deal of anger. He converted most of it into the house and the shipyard work and the 4 children and the fig tree. He put the anger somewhere it would produce something. Trey had said he could have just been angry. Alton had said yes, he had that option. He chose the other one. Trey had said, did he ever just be angry? Alton had thought about that. He had said once. In 1955, in a store on Washington Street, a man behind the counter spoke to him in a way that was not acceptable. Jerome had said very quietly, in the specific tone of a man who has decided that quiet is more dangerous than loud, "You will not speak to me that way again in any store in this city." He had paid for what he came to buy, and he had left. Alton had been 4 years old and had been in the store with him. He had not understood at 4 what had happened. He had understood it fully at about 14 when he had replayed the memory with the understanding he had built in the intervening years. He had asked his father about it at 14. Jerome had said that was anger in its most useful form, not a raised voice. Precision. I told him exactly what was going to happen, and then I left. Trey had said, "What did you do with it?" Alton had said, "I went inside when they called me. I sat in my seat. I accepted the acknowledgement. And then I went home and I wrote the account." Trey had said, "Did writing the account help?" Alton had thought about that question. He had said the account helps because the account is the form that the anger takes when you convert it into something permanent. The anger itself does not help in the long run. Anger keeps you in the moment when you need to move past the moment. But the account says this happened on this date in this place, and here is what it was, and here is what it required of me. The account is still there when the anger is not there. The account is still there when you are not there. He had said the account is in the record. The record is there for the person who reads it next year or 10 years from now. That is what the account is for. The account is not for me. It is for the next person who stands at that door. Trey had said, "But it was your door." Alton had said yes. And before it was my door, it was a different version of the same door for men in my father's generation. And before that, it was a different version for their fathers. The door has been there a long time. The accounts have been accumulating. My account goes on the pile. He had said your great-grandfather never wrote an account. He could not have in 1955 in a way that would have gone into any official record. What he did was do it precisely. He told the man exactly what was going to happen. He paid. He left. He came home and he built. The building is the account he left. He had said the house is his account. The fig tree is his account. You are part of his account. Trey had been quiet for a long time. He had said, "Is that how you thought about it in the Army too?" Alton had said yes. He had said in the Army you write after action reports. You write what happened and what should have happened and what you would do differently. The report is not for you. It is for the next unit that goes into the same situation. You make the record honest so that the next people have what they need. Trey had said, and the wall of honor is the same thing. Alton had thought about that. He had said yes. The wall says these people were here. They did these things. The evidence is specific. It is dated. It is sourced. You can read it and know what happened. He had said that is why I argued for it. And that is why it mattered that my photograph was on it that night. Not because it humiliated the officer, because the wall said what was true. And what was true was in the room in the permanent record in a form that could not be taken back. Trey had said your picture is going to be on that wall for a really long time, isn't it? Alton had said yes. That is the purpose of the wall. His grandson had looked at the window. He had said, "Is the fig tree the same way?" Alton had looked at him. Trey had said, like, Grandpa Jerome planted it, and it's still there. It's the record that he was here. Alton had been quiet. He had said, "I had not thought of it that way." He had said, "But yes, I think that is right." He had looked at the fig tree through the kitchen window. It was November, and the tree was bare. The way it was every November, the figs long since picked and eaten, and the preserves long since made and stored. But the tree was there. The root system was there under the ground the way it had been since 1952, holding the tree in the specific permanent way of something that has been in one place for long enough that the place and the thing have become the same thing. He had watched Marcus come around the side of the house earlier in the afternoon and stand in front of the fig tree and look at it the way a 9-year-old looks at a thing he has been told is important and is trying to understand what the importance looks like. Marcus had looked at it for a long time. He had come back inside and had asked Celestine how long until August. Celestine had said 9 months. Marcus had said that is a long time. Celestine had said the tree doesn't think so. The tree has done it 71 times. Marcus had looked at his grandfather. He had said, "Is this tree older than you?" Alton had said by 1 year. Marcus had looked back at the tree. He had said, "So it was here before you were here." Alton had said yes. Marcus had said, "And it's going to be here after." Alton had said yes. That is the idea. Joy had come in from outside a few minutes after Marcus. She had been standing in the yard watching the tree from a different angle, the angle that looked at the roots where they met the ground, which was the part of the tree that was least interesting to most people, and that Joy had apparently found the most interesting. She had said the roots are very big. Celestine had said yes. Joy had said they go under the whole yard, don't they? Celestine had said a lot of it. Joy had said then, even if the tree weren't there, the roots would still be there. Celestine had looked at Alton. Alton had looked at Joy. He had said yes. I had not thought of it quite that way. Joy had said, "So the tree is the part you can see, but the part that makes it stay is underground." Alton had been quiet for a moment. He had said yes. "I think that is exactly right." Jerome Beaumont Sr. had planted it in the yard of a house he had purchased with the wages of a man who had come home from Korea and decided to build something permanent. It was still there. The record was still there. Alton had gone to the Thursday meeting the week after the Veterans Day ceremony, and the week after that, and every Thursday after that. He had sat in the third seat from the left in the first row. He had done the work of the Post's executive committee. He had attended the events. He had walked past his photograph on the wall every time he walked in. He had not looked at it every time. He had looked at it some of the time, the way you look at a thing that has been in a place long enough that it does not require your constant attention. It was there. It was accurate. It said what needed to be said. He had done his part. He had put it on the wall. He had made sure the record was honest. He had attended the following year's Veterans Day ceremony. He had driven to the hall on the south side and had parked in the lot and had walked to the door. There was a different officer working the door. He had shown his membership card, which was in his wallet where it had always been. The officer had looked at it and had looked at him and had said, "Welcome, sir." He had gone inside. He had walked past his photograph. He had sat in the third seat from the left in the first row where his name was on a card, because it was always on a card. The 47 people in the hall on the previous year's ceremony had been replaced by a slightly different 47 people, some of the same faces, some new ones. The specific, ongoing composition of a community event that is held every year and that draws from the same membership and the same families. Some of the people there had been there the year before and had seen the hall go quiet when the post commander called the third name and had watched Alton come in and sit down. Some of them were there again. A woman who had been seated in the fourth row the previous year, the wife of a Vietnam veteran named Thomas, who had died in the spring, and whose absence from the room was a fact that everyone who had known him was aware of, had come up to Alton before the ceremony and had said, "I wanted you to know that I thought about what happened last year. My husband talked about it. He said that man handled himself the way a soldier handles himself, with everything he was entitled to and nothing he wasn't." Alton had said Thomas was a good man. She had said he was. He was proud to know you. He had said the feeling was mutual. She had gone back to her seat. He had sat in his. The ceremony had begun. Kenneth had called the names. The hall had been quiet in the right way. The way it was always quiet during the names. The way a room full of people who have served is quiet when the service is being acknowledged, which is a quiet that contains many things and that does not require explanation. He had thought during the ceremony the wall is working, not in the sense that it had resolved the previous year's incident. The wall had not resolved the incident. The investigation had resolved the incident in the way that investigations resolve things by finding the procedure violation and assigning the consequence and filing the document. The wall had not resolved anything, but the wall had been what it was supposed to be. It had been the evidence that could not be removed. It had been the record that was in the room when the process was not yet operating. It had been the third entry from the left that the post commander had pointed to when he said the documentation is on the wall. That was what the wall was for. He had made sure the record was honest. That was what he had. That was what he had always had. Jerome Beaumont Sr. had come home from Korea in 1951 with both his legs and a Bronze Star, and the knowledge of what he had been in and the decision that the next thing he was going to do was build something that would stand after he was gone. He had built the house. He had planted the fig tree. He had raised 4 children and put them in the world with what they needed to know about what they were worth. Alton had taken what was given and had built what he built. He had built 30 years of service and a wall with 8 photographs and a record that asked a question the procedure finding had not answered. He had built a grandson who wanted an official photograph, and a granddaughter who understood that the part that makes the tree stay is underground, and a 9-year-old who looked at a fig tree in November and understood that it was waiting because it knew August would come. He had attended every Thursday meeting and every Veterans Day ceremony and every event where the Post gathered to do the work of remembering and continuing. He had attended the August pig roast and the July 4th cookout and the Memorial Day ceremony at the County Veterans Memorial and the 2 funerals the Post had organized in the past year for members who had died. Raymond Ellis in 2018, Gerald Washington in 2019, and then 3 more in the years that followed. The Korea generation aging out in the way that generations age out, leaving their photographs on the wall, and their chairs empty at the Thursday meetings, and their names in the member rolls that were read at the annual tribute. He had helped fold the flag at Gerald Washington's military funeral. He had stood at the grave of Raymond Ellis and had thought about the story Raymond used to tell, the one about the fairgrounds fundraiser that had been genuinely funny, and had been grateful that he had heard it, and that he had the memory of it because Raymond was gone, and the story was now only in the memories of the people who had heard it told. He had walked past his photograph each time. He had not needed to look at it. He knew what it said. He had put it there. That was what you left behind when you could no longer walk in the door, a fig tree in a yard, and a photograph on a wall, and a record that said what was true. And the record would say it after he was gone. The record did not need him to maintain it. The record was self-maintaining. The way a root system is self-maintaining, it was in the ground. It was holding the thing up, and it would continue to do both long after the person who had built it was no longer available to answer questions about it. Jerome Beaumont Sr. was not available to answer questions about the house or the fig tree. The house was still on the south side. The fig tree was still in the yard. The figs came in August. The root system was underground. The wall was in the hall on the south side of Vicksburg. The photograph was the third from the left. The citation language was 32 words plus service information. The record asked a question that the procedure finding had not answered. All of it was in the file. All of it was in the wall. All of it was in the ground. That was what the wall was for. That was what Jerome had built the house for. That was what Alton had argued for at the Post meeting in 2012 when he had said the stories need to be on the wall, not in a file. On the wall where anyone who walks in can see them. The wall was there. The stories were on it. That was enough. That was the purpose of the record. That was why his father had told him in 2 hours at a kitchen table in 1974, on the night before he enlisted, you write the after action. You do not soften what happened. You put it in the record so that the next person has what they need. He had put it in the record. Every time. That was the work. That was what the work was.